Welcome to More Context, where I try to provide more context to stories in the news. Today, I examine the story of Imane Khelif and the fight for truth. What I'm about to go through is an incredibly stupid story that everyone seemed to get wrong, but I think that is the point. Now, you may be thinking, the Olympics were a while ago, why am I bringing this up? Well, this was Ted Cruz last week.
Look, I know a lot of y'all at home, for example, saw two biological men competing in women's boxing at the Olympics. That was wildly unfair. My youngest daughter plays volleyball. It's not fair for a biological boy or man, a teenage boy, to spike the volleyball ladder, and he has voted repeatedly in favor of that.
Let's start with the facts. Imane Khelif is a women's boxer from Algeria. She was assigned female at birth, has always been female. Then last year, she was disqualified for not being female by a group no longer recognized by the Olympic Committee, and which provided no evidence. She qualified for the Olympics, and after she beat an Italian boxer, the Italian boxer complained and social media went crazy. Imane Khelif went on to win gold at the Olympics, and now lawsuits over this have begun. So what does the IBA, her accusers, have to say? Well, for context, the Olympic Committee withdrew recognition of the IBA last year over concerns around finances, governance, ethics, refereeing, and judging. So suffice to say, they had a lot of disagreements. But here's where it gets interesting. The IBA actually put out an official statement about this situation. And I think the most important sentence of their entire statement says the following. Point to note, the athletes did not undergo a testosterone examination, but were subject to a separate and recognized test, whereby the specifics remain confidential. That's right. Officially, they don't make any claim about what kind of test they administered. So while social media was buzzing with claims first that she was trans, then that she had high testosterone or some intersex condition of some kind, all of those claims are based on nothing. For all we know, the test was simply he called up the boys and voted on who looked too manly. Officially, they simply claim she was not a woman, and they won't say why or in what way. So case closed, right? How can I disprove a claim if they don't even make a claim? Well, there actually is a test that we are supposed to assume that they did, but they didn't tell us. If you dig deeper, you find the IBA rules define a woman exclusively as someone with XX chromosomes. Therefore, we are supposed to assume it was a chromosome test, and she must not have had XX chromosomes. Furthermore, the head of the IBA actually gave an interview saying she had XY chromosomes. But then why leave it out of the official statement? You already broke confidentiality when you gave the interview. The claim that she's not a woman is much more dangerous than the claim that she's XY, because defining sex based solely on chromosomes is stupid. I will dedicate an entire slide to that in a bit, but notably, the Olympic boxing also does not define a woman that way. Still, I must keep asking, why leave out the claim that she is XY? So I think a leading contender here is simple corruption. There could be something wrong with the test. Perhaps it was unreliable, or they actually didn't do a chromosome test but prefer that people just assumed that they did. Also, I would note, she had already beaten a Russian in the tournament, and the IBA is headed by a Russian. Perhaps it is that simple. It could also be part of a propaganda effort. The story certainly was used by propagandists, but did they leave out the claim that she was XY specifically for propaganda purposes? And why would they do that? So why would leaving out key facts be good for propaganda? Well, conspiracy-minded people will still figure it out on their own, and then they're even more invested because they figured it out. It also makes the story harder to disprove, and debunkers can get the story wrong. And if this happens, which it did in this case, it pushes people away from legitimate news sites and towards those purposely spreading propaganda. Also, this isn't the only made-up story. It is part of an entire ecosystem of fake stories, spread by conservatives and sometimes Russia. This ecosystem requires a constant flow of fake stories to fuel constant outrage. If they ever stop, then people might stop being afraid, and their entire political project could collapse. And finally, it is bait. They know they are leaving out important things, and liberals will point that out. But as long as liberals are arguing in those terms, rather than addressing the larger concerns, as I will shortly, then the propagandists are winning. So in this election, Republicans are running on fear of two groups of people, immigrants and trans people. I'll start with immigrants. There, Democrats have taken the bait and support the largely Republican border bill that Republicans abandoned at Trump's urging. Democrats think they are so smart because this shows Trump doesn't really want to get things done. But what they've done is actually conceded the idea that immigrants are scary. Did you know immigrants have substantially lower crime rates than those born here? That they boost our economy, and to the extent they can lower wages, it is only because we refuse to allow them to be documented, leaving them in exploitable situations. It is often the very same people who benefit the most from cheap migrant labor who push for anti-migrant propaganda because they want to keep them exploitable. Just so long as we don't actually deport them all. Just another classic story of capital dividing and conquering labor. And so Trump and Vance are happy to lie about immigrants eating your pets, as long as the Democratic response is, well, actually these immigrants were legal and we have no proof that they actually ate any pets, but don't worry, we're the ones who actually want to push legislation through that would let us close the border because we recognize your fear. As long as these stories keep reminding people to be afraid of immigrants, and that Republicans are more extreme to solve the fear that they manufactured, then it's a win for Republicans. Democrats need to remind people they shouldn't be afraid of immigrants. Now, the fear of trans people is actually a bit different, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Here's how the Democrat responded to the clip of Ted Cruz that I showed earlier.
As I said, I don't support boys playing girls' sports, but let's be clear about the Equality Act, which was a bipartisan vote in the Congress. It was endorsed by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. For folks at home who don't know what that is, that's basically the biggest speaking organ for the business community. By the National Association of Manufacturers, this is not a radical bill. What it's saying is that folks shouldn't be discriminated against. But what Ted Cruz wants to do apparently is. But he also, again, just wants to distract you. That's what he's going to do. He's been doing it for 12 years. Folks are sick of it. I hear from you all the time about it. Let's turn the page and let's elect someone else.
He is so quick to set his own record straight. He fails to call out Ted Cruz for his radical position. It is Ted Cruz who is attacking women's sports and calling women men. If the IBA statement was made for propaganda purposes, that would suggest they are doing it on behalf of someone. And it turns out they have a ton of connections to Russia. Umar Kremlev, the head of the IBA, has close ties to Putin, a known fan of boxing. After taking over the IBA, he moved their operations to Russia, made Gazprom, the Russian state oil company, their main sponsor, and Gazprom even paid off all their debts. To this day, you will find Gazprom listed side by side with the IBA logo at the bottom of their website. But okay, so Russia has some influence. Have they ever used it? Well, yes, they have. You see, the IBA banned Ukrainians from competing, even when not competing inside Russia. So it's clear Russia and Putin have a lot of influence over the IBA, and they have used it in the past. But what about this story? Well, it was recently announced that there were a series of American conservative commentators that are under investigation because they're being paid millions of dollars from Russia. Here's a few tweets regarding this topic from Tim Pool, probably the largest of those wrapped up in this investigation. Olympic domestic violence. I mean, really? That's what you want to call two boxers who agree to box? Talk about trying to maximize outrage. Also, you can see here why I'm not using any images of the Olympics. And now, with the second tweet, he says, so he just found out he's a guy. So purposefully misgendering, now apparently not limited to trans people, but for anyone who they suspect doesn't meet their ever-shrinking definition of a woman. But also, look how bad the statement he's responding to is. Imane Khelif has always defined herself as a woman and has every right to compete. I mean, that's a nice transpositive statement, but she wasn't the only one who defined herself as a woman. Algeria and society broadly defined her sex as female. She was born with lady parts. This isn't a story of someone defining their own sex. This is a story about a group of guys arbitrarily redefining what it means to be a woman and then going around on a modern-day witch hunt, but with even less thought than you would see in a Monty Python sketch. So why would Russia push this story? Well, Russia was barred from the Olympics, so any story to make the Olympics look worse is good for them. Also, they like to maximize division in the West. Their Ukraine strategy relies on the West eventually growing divided and slowing down support for Ukraine. And this story obviously won't get there on its own, but every little bit. Also, they want to support right-wing parties that are allies of Putin. And most of these parties have been attacking trans rights as a major social issue to gain support for some time. And finally, it's another fake story to add to their own ecosystem of fake stories, just like what our conservatives have. Now, let me be clear. While there are some direct connections between conservatives here in the US and Russia, the bigger story is that they don't need direct connections because their interests are aligned. They both want to create fact-free media environments where they can keep their followers on a 24/7 drip of fake, fear-driven stories. This has not been the first effort to redefine women. A few Olympic sports have started enforcing testosterone levels in women's sports. This has been a controversial effort. It does create a pathway for trans athletes to compete, but it ends up excluding women with naturally high testosterone levels. And while men usually aren't tested, results from the GH2000 study showed substantial overlap in testosterone levels between the sexes, even at the Olympic level. So men could get their levels tested, and some may be allowed in women's sports if we continue with this set of rules, and if they're willing to admit that they have low testosterone. Caster Semenya of South Africa was notably kept out of the Olympics due to naturally high testosterone levels. There has been a lot of debate on this solution, some upset that it seems like you're redefining women based on testosterone levels, while those pushing for it try to sell it as being more like having different weight classes. That doesn't really pass the smell test when the only classes are men and women, and you're only having women go through this extra scrutiny. But at least there's some evidence linking athletic abilities with testosterone. Meanwhile, anti-trans activists, unhappy that testosterone testing allows for trans women, have instead been pushing for chromosome testing, specifically because a person can't change their chromosomes. So what's wrong with chromosome testing besides the obvious effort to exclude trans women? Put simply, there are many reasons you can be female but not XX. I want to highlight the sex-determining region of the Y chromosome, or SRY gene, which is sometimes absent from the Y chromosome, producing XY women. And sometimes it can be found in the X chromosome, producing XX men. So yes, genetic testing can in some cases explain why some women aren't XX and some men aren't XY. And then there are many hormonal conditions. Then you can have combinations of conditions. If you only look at chromosomal or genetic or hormonal sex, you're not guaranteed to correctly identify someone's apparent sex. And so excluding people based solely on one of those, especially without demonstrating an athletic advantage, seems really weird to me. Supposedly, this is all done to protect women from having to compete with men, but you're pushing a rule that would allow XX men to compete in women's athletics. That seems like a problem to me. I realize those pushing this have just defined women as exclusively XX, so I worry about XY women. They aren't, quote, real women. And yes, I've heard them referred that way. I don't want to be in the business of trying to tell people if they're real or not, but as an example of how ridiculous this definition is, while most XY women are infertile, most is not all. So you've chosen a definition which fails to include some cis women who have given birth. If you want to tell someone who has given birth that they aren't real enough of a woman, good luck with that. Why are people trying to redefine women? Those pushing the chromosome testing will say it's to protect women's sports from men. And by men, they mean trans women, ignoring that their solution would allow some actual men to compete in women's sports, which seems more unfair than trans women competing, but I digress. And there's no concern at all for the women who are declared not real based on the arbitrary definitions they've chosen. And also no concern that they're demanding the scrutinization and testing of every woman. Far more cis women would be affected by this than trans women. And here's the thing, though. None of this is necessary. Like, there are some legitimate concerns to have around trans women in sports and fairness. We don't have to redefine women and randomly exclude some women or randomly include some men just to set up rules around when trans women can compete in particular sports. We could just set up rules pertaining to trans athletes and when it's fair or not for them to compete. Why all the tests? This hasn't happened in a vacuum. It's the same people pushing for this that are pushing for genital checking laws and bathroom bills in some states. It seems to me the real concern, not only isn't with protecting women, it's not even a fear of trans women broadly. Anti-trans propaganda runs into the same contradiction every time, that it's supposedly to protect women, but every woman must be inspected and viewed with suspicion, because what they're actually afraid of is secret trans women. And we see the same fear throughout media, from Ace Ventura to Something About Miriam. Over and over again, the actual fear weak men have is that they might be attracted to a secret trans woman, and all the sexual insecurities weak men have about that. So they want every woman tested just to make sure they never have to face such an embarrassment. So don't give any ground on this issue. They're lying when they say men boxed women at the Olympics. They're lying when they say they want to protect women but turn around and call women men and demand every woman be tested to fit their new definitions of a woman, all just to protect their own fragile little egos. Finally, I would like to close with what I thought was the most important line of the VP debate.
The rules were that you guys weren't going to fact check.
This election is becoming the battle for truth, and we can't afford to lose, even as Democrats seem so ill-equipped to fight it. Well, that's it for today. Let me know in the YouTube comments what you think, and don't forget to like and subscribe.